Hi, welcome to week 5 of Christian Community Development and the Social Justice Tradition. This week, we're going to focus on understanding the unique roles of different social justice traditions. This week is going to be one of the most challenging, but also one of the most important weeks to cover. It's going to be challenging, I think, for students to receive. It's also going to be really challenging for me to deliver. I'm going to be talking about different traditions, and my goal is to affirm all of them, but it's going to be a challenge because anytime you talk about any group, there's the chance to offend. So my goal is not to offend, it's to affirm people. So let me just talk about how this lesson fits into the bigger picture of the course. So as we talked about, one of the goals of the course is many people will come into this course having passion for one justice tradition. So I call that having an I, and then you want to become more of like a T in terms of your education. So understand and value other justice traditions, right? So let me also talk with you about my personal history across justice traditions. For whatever reason, God had a unique purpose for me, and even in writing this course, makes me understand I've been a part of many justice traditions, more than most people I know, and I think that is part of how God's prepared me for being president of City Vision University, and what we're trying to do with City Vision University is we're trying to span justice traditions. But let me talk a little bit about my history. So I actually got started in the Black church. My dad became a storefront minister of an African American congregation. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But became very familiar with the Black church. And then whenever I first started to get involved in ministry after college, I was mentored under African American church. And I love the Black church. The Black church is absolutely amazing. So I first started, I had left God during my teen years, and I came back to God during college, partly through volunteering at a rescue mission, City Union Mission in Kansas City. And we've had relationships with rescue missions. I've had a relationship with rescue missions since 1992. But City Vision was founded out of the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions in 1998, got accredited in 2005. And then in 2008, it moved beyond rescue missions and became part of the organization that I founded called Tech Mission. So the organization Tech Mission, though, itself, all of our founding board members were leaders in the Christian Community Development Association movement. Myself, I attended CCDA conferences for over 10 years. Rudy Carrasco, who took over after John Perkins at Harambe in Pasadena, is the executive director there, and Marcus Thorne, who is, at least for a short period, executive director of Lawndale. And many others were co-founders of Tech Mission. So that is a part of my family. Each of these groups I feel like are part of my family. I have a very complex family. Then in Boston, I moved into an urban church, and it was predominantly Latino, had a Puerto Rican pastor, and was there for 12 years and learned to love the Latina church. And then the Salvation Army has been a partner with us for, I think, about 17 years. We have had a board president from the Salvation Army for over a decade. I also love the Salvation Army. And part of what we're trying to do here at City Vision, many schools will say that they're non-denominational, right? But then they have strong affiliations. Part of what we're trying to do is, if you look at each of these organizations would say that they're non-denominational generally, maybe except for the churches, but often these justice traditions almost become like parachurch denominations. What we're trying to do is to say we're going to try to be to span these denominations. That doesn't mean that we don't see the unique value that different groups have, and it also doesn't mean that we don't appreciate those. So let me get into the big picture goals of this course, and this is again a summary. What we want to avoid in this course is we don't want this just to become about comparing and leaving you less passionate about your primary tradition, because then you want to be like this other tradition. We don't want to minimize the distinctives between traditions. Those are extremely important. And But what I do want to do is I want you to deepen the understanding of your own tradition, to apply Christian community development principles to your tradition, and to understand other traditions that can help. So let me talk a little bit about, we talked about the holistic ministry across 4 quadrants, and each tradition often will specialize in one quadrant. Majority culture is going to be good. White majority culture is going to be good in this quadrant. And then you have a lot of relief organizations and rescue missions and Salvation Army that are going to be, spanning these 2 quadrants. And then you have other groups that are going to do well in the cultural quadrant, and then others that are focused on the societal quadrant. It's extremely difficult for an organization to do all 4 of these, but it's recognizing that God's perspective is that the whole body of Christ needs to be addressing all of these, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through these different traditions, and I'm going to talk about some justice dimensions that can help you understand some of the differences between these. So one of the justice dimensions is what I'd say, what is your dominant justice framework? And I'm going to present 4. One is race-centric. So a black church might be more race-centric, class-centric, gender-centric, or majority culture, which is not having any of those. Then there's a class identity, which we already covered. So the class background, identification, access, and consciousness, but that's not applied to you as an individual. That'd be applied to your organization or movement. There's how it serves the poor and addressing injustice. Is it ministry of the poor? Because it consists of the poor. Is it with the poor or to the poor? And then a huge factor is the funding model. So, if you're serving at-risk populations, or you're trying to be, multi-ethnic or multiracial, there's a question of, are you funded by those you're serving, or are they 2 different cultural groups? So if you're serving the poor, they may not be able to fund you, right? But if you're in a black church, then you're serving the black community, and it's also funding you. The other big thing that's really big for multi-ethnic ministries is, does your funding model require that all or most staff have high access to social capital? Because a lot of missions organizations and a lot of campus groups like InterVarsity and Crew require that everyone do individual fundraising, and that has huge implications to ethnic and racial groups, or even class groups that don't have high access to social capital, because if you don't know anyone who has resources, then it's going to be hard for you to do fundraising, right? So just as a review, there's 4 aspects of class identity, and I'll talk about these: class consciousness, class background, class identification, and class access. All 4 of those make up the class identity of an organization. Now, to understand organizations, do you have a race-centric or class-centric perspective? It's helpful to have this race and class grid. So this is, different racial groups here, and then you have different class groups. And a race-centric organization or tradition would basically see the view, and you'd talk about things in terms of race. You're going to talk about racism. You're going to talk about racial injustice. You might use the word class, and occasionally if you talk about race, class, and gender, but that's not the core of what your organization's about. The core of your organization is about talking about race. So that would be a race-centric perspective. Then there's class-centric organizations. So organizations that by their mission, they're focused on serving the poor, generally are going to be class-centric. And as I mentioned, I like to separate out classes into dominant class and non-dominant class to avoid the issue with the imperial middle. And then there's also gender-centric organization. This course is focused on race and class primarily. We cover gender more in our leadership course. But one thing I want to talk about is what happens with race, class, and gender in churches and organizations. So fundamentally, this thing that I'm saying here, the inherent fallenness of society creates overwhelming forces for justice-oriented churches and ministries to only effectively address one of the 3. So some of you may have heard of the project management triangle. You can pick, I think, what is it, cost, speed, or quality, but you can't pick all 3. It's a little bit like that, but usually you can pick one, maybe 2. And what happens is So if you are, say, a lower income white church, often it's going to be more difficult for you to be to work towards justice on race and gender, just because the needs of your congregation, and also to a certain extent the education level of your congregation. So that's going to become much more challenging, because you start with where people are, and to understand a lot of these things, it does require getting more education. So then you have often you have upper middle class white churches and organizations, and they are among the best in terms of gender and having more women in ministry. But often those organizations, because they're upper middle class and they're white, often they don't do as well on race and class. And then a lot of ethnic churches and organizations may not do as well on gender and class. Now this is just a generalization. I'm not saying this is true. I've seen Latino churches, Latina churches that were very multi-class, right? But this is just often this is the inherent way that the fallenness directs people. And then you have dominant culture organizations that aren't going to basically focus on any of the three, addressing any of the three. So with that, let me get into the different models. And I'm going to use this race and class grid to kind of provide a map of the model. So a multi-ethnic rescue mission and Salvation Army. If you look at the basic model of what they're doing, so they're focused on serving the poor. So they're working on serving the lower middle working class, but what they largely do is they are transferring wealth. They're doing class reconciliation, and a lot of the groups that they're raising money from, predominantly the groups that they're raising money from are white. So that is the profile of a typical rescue mission and Salvation Army. That's not to say that there's not going to be, middle class people in leadership or things along those lines, but I'm just saying this is the social, what society puts pressure, in that direction. So if you look at what I would call these models, both Rescue Mission or Salvation Army, I call them a lower class focused ministry model. And the unique role is ministry with the poor to get resources to the poorest. So one of the strengths that they have, and if you go to any rescue mission or Salvation Army, you're going to see, half to a third of the staff are people who came through the program. So that is a class reconciliation. And they're indigenously raising up leaders, but they're doing it usually across social class. So the class background is ministry with the poor. They're strongly focused on transferring resources from those who have more resources to the poor. Class identification, both Salvation Army and rescue missions, they have a lot, they like to have a lot of control over education. They like to raise up leadership from within. And what that does is it allows them to have people that follow their values. And I would say a lot of their values have to do with class identification and not having, the identification with the elite. So what a lot of schools do is they'll train people, and then they create kind of classist attitudes and elitist attitudes, and they class assimilate. And what a lot of Salvation Army and rescue missions, and I don't think that this is conscious, but the net effect is that they make sure that, the Salvation Army, all their officers go through their training. And a lot of times rescue missions and the Salvation Army gets criticized for being not being as pro-education, but I think a big reason for that is because a lot of rescue missions and Salvation Army, what they'll say that education often messes people up. It makes them not as practical. It makes them too focused on theory. It makes them, lose their faith and things along those lines. So that's all about class identification through, they have policies to create that. Class access, and social capital, rescue missions and the Salvation Army have amazing levels of class access to the upper classes and to distribute resources, largely through charity, but that can make them financially dependent on the upper classes. So that they also will promote gaining class access. So that would be education to individuals, but a distrust of the spiritual effect in the of what I would call the classism of educational institutions, where it essentially secularizes people. These movements do not promote class consciousness. They do all this unconsciously, I would say. And the framework I would describe as class-centric. So the reason why I describe it as class-centric is because they're primarily about serving the poor. The funding model is those providing funding are in a different cultural group from those being served, and that can create some class tensions and also racial tensions, because often the leadership has to be culturally close to those being served, and then that can create some cross-cultural tension. So that's the first model. Again, whenever I talk about this, I want people to recognize I love the Salvation Army. I love rescue missions. I love the role that they're doing. So none of this is intended to be a critique of them. So another group to consider is Pentecostals in developing countries. So if you look at the global Pentecostal movement, and we'll talk about that in the last week of the course, it's predominantly of the non-dominant classes. So the poor, the lower middle, and working class. So in this model, its unique role is a church culturally of the poor. And the class background, its ministry of the poor, the church culture strongly fits with the class culture of the poor, creating self-selection. So someone who comes from a middle class or upper middle class background might go to the church, and then they say, I don't like how boisterous they are. This makes me feel uncomfortable. I'm used to a quiet business environment. So class identification through policies, often there's strong control over education to avoid class assimilation or secular assimilation, raising up leadership from within. On the class access and social capital, very little access to the upper classes to redistribute resources. But it does promote gaining class access to be upwardly mobile, and doesn't promote class consciousness. The framework, again, is class-centric, even though it's not conscious. And the funding model, in contrast to rescue missions and the Salvation Army, is those who are providing the funding to the pastors of these Pentecostal churches or charismatic churches. They're in the same cultural group as those being served. So that's another group. A third group is the Latin American liberation theology and Catholic worker traditions. Again, they are focused on the poor, but because of the history of those movements and because of their affiliations with the Catholic Church, they're going to have access to the middle and upper class white groups through the Catholic Church, and middle and upper class Latina groups within the Catholic Church. So within this group, the unique role is political, changing political and economic systems of exploitation. It's ministry to the poor, often because it might be academic groups that do a lot of the writing, so that would be the to the poor, or with the poor. It's worth noting that lower classes, I've heard the phrase said that liberation theologians indicated a preference for the poor, but the poor indicated a preference for Pentecostalism. And part of the reason for that is that the lower classes often self-select increasingly to Pentecostalism because it fits their culture. And so the mission of this, it's strongly focused on changing systems that perpetuate poverty, and the class identification, strong theology to maintain class identification. Christian worker movements are often led by middle class individuals, but they maintain their class identification with the working class and the poor. Class access, often they have strong access to the upper classes through the Catholic Church to affect political systems, but then can be financially dependent on the upper classes through the Catholic Church. Often the language, if you read liberation theologians, it can be much more upper, middle, and upper class language. And that's because they're writing to influence systems. This group, out of all the groups, is the most class conscious, and they have class conscious theology, and their framework, again, is class-centric. So all of these models up to now have been focused on the lower classes, and they've been class-centric models. And I lump them together because I want to talk about some lessons for them together. Lower classes self-select largely to groups that fit their culture. So it doesn't matter as much what your words say and what your cognitive says. They're gonna look more at what the culture is. The culture is a fit more than being politically for the poor, as I mentioned before. Class identification, often the class identification is done through organizational structures and culture rather than through an individual process. So people, within these groups aren't intentionally saying, I'm going to be downwardly mobile. What's happening is the organization has structures that help keep people downwardly mobile by having control over education and promoting from within. Access to social capital. It's difficult to gain class access while maintaining class identification. So if you gain access to the rich, often assimilation happens unless you manage the educational process. And that's part of what we're trying to do here at City Vision, just to make a point, is we're trying to help people gain class access to be able to have the language that they need, but also to not assimilate and lose their identification with the poor, to move up, but not out necessarily. And class consciousness, often the political environment will not tolerate promoting class consciousness. Salvation Army, rescue missions, they just can't promote class consciousness. It's not, politically viable in the United States. And class consciousness becomes more possible as you gain class access. So if you're middle class, then you can become more class conscious. And it's also more necessary because it's going to be important for you to understand what's happening with class to avoid the assimilation. That's something that I had to do in my own process. Whenever I went to MIT, I got class assimilated, but I had to understand social class to get essentially unassimilated. And I think that becomes important. So that's some of the lessons from the lower class dominant ministry models. Now I'm going to talk about multi-class Black churches. So this model is race-centric. Many Black churches are multi-class. There's some that will, I would say a good portion are going to be dominated either by the lower middle and working class or upper middle, and then same thing with Latina churches. And what's the unique role there? It's to be a ministry of the Black community or the Latino community. So, and often you're going to have ministry of the poor, with the poor, and to the poor if you're going to be multi-class. And the mission to focus on the Black community often makes, or Latino community often makes, class an inherent focus. Class identity. Maintaining racial identity will also often maintain class identification if they're in lower class dominant churches. So if you're Black and you're in a lower class dominant church, that's going to maintain your class identity. But often what happens, education will result in class education, as I mentioned before. Most educational institutions are class assimilating, and they might promote racial identity, but often they don't promote a downward orientation in class identification. And that's not to say that anyone who gets educated is going to sell out, but what it means is they're going to have to become much more class conscious to maintain both their racial identity and their downwardly mobile class identification. Class access and social capital. Both Black and Latino community strongly promotes being upwardly mobile and class access in terms of education. Often it's financially dependent on middle or upper class, Black or Latino community. Class consciousness strongly promotes racial awareness, but generally doesn't strongly promote class consciousness. It's if they're going to use it, they're going to use it in racial terms. And the framework's race-centric. And one big advantage of this model and the funding model is that those providing funding are in the same cultural group of those being served. And, that has huge implications. And I've seen many Black churches that are multi-class, and they play a huge role in class reconciliation, within, ethnic groups. So the next group I want to talk about, so you'll have multi-class white churches. So you might have a white church that has rich people, poor people. That is a justice model, right? Because even though they're not addressing race as much, but they are addressing class injustice. Then you might have predominantly white dominant class groups, but they still are justice focused. So that's another model. And the unique role of this group is going to be educating, changing systems of injustice, community of support for majority cultural Christians addressing injustice, providing social capital, and giving resources to ministries that are closer to community, with and of the poor. So usually the class background is going to be mostly ministry to the poor, sometimes with ministry with the poor. But the mission is strongly focused on changing systems that perpetuate poverty. So some examples of this group might be, if you're familiar with the Sojourners movement or mainline denominations, or people have heard about the Christian left. So this would be the white Christian left, so to speak. So this group has very high access to social capital, can play a key role in building the social capital of the poor, doesn't generally promote class consciousness. Generally, this group most often actually will be gender-centric, even more than race-centric, but often will be, talk about race. And those providing funding are in a different cultural group than those being served when this group serves the poor. Now, another group that's really important is upper middle class, white dominant, multi-ethnic church or ministry. So this might be, I would say, most multi-ethnic churches that I've seen, many diverse Christian colleges, college campus groups like InterVarsity, most often will follow this model. So they'll have a multi-ethnic fellowship. They might have, Black Campus Ministries fellowship, but most often the multi-ethnic fellowship is going to either be white dominant or Asian dominant. And it has a unique role. And I would say probably the most significant unique role is educating and raising up leaders in reconciliation and cross-cultural ministry and ethnic and gender identity and changing systems of injustice. So if you look at InterVarsity Press, they've put out more books on racism and racial justice and ethnic identity development than any other group. It's amazing, and that shows their unique role. They've raised up many leaders, many of the top leaders who are writing these books, came out of these type of ministries. And the class background, ministry to the poor, and ministry with the poor, class identification. Usually they are upper middle class, but they have a downward orientation. Their class access and social capital is very high. They play a key role in building the social capital of the poor, generally do not promote class consciousness. Their frameworks generally are going to be either race-centric or gender-centric. And the funding model, and this is one of the biggest challenges for those, is those funding are often in a different group than those being served if they're serving the poor, or if they have a multi-ethnic fellowship. If groups that have historical oppression, especially African-American community and Latina community, because of that historical oppression, they're going to have, on average, lower access to social capital, and that's going to make it more difficult to do fundraising because of their individual fundraising model. So let me just go and compare these ministries, and this is just going to be kind of a summary. So Salvation Army, their unique mission is ministries with the poor to get resources to the poorest. And their dominant frameworks, class, they have a lower class background, strong identification with the poor, high class access, low class consciousness. Developing country Pentecostals, church culturally of the poor, lower class background, strong identification with the poor, low class access, low class consciousness, and dominant frameworks as class. Multi-class ethnic church, ministry of the Black community, or ministry of the Latina community. And the dominant class background is going to vary. Same thing with identification, access. The class consciousness is going to be, it's going to vary. But the dominant framework is race. Liberation theology and the Christian workers movement, their unique role is changing political and economic systems to be more just. Their dominant class background often is, middle, even though they are downwardly mobile. They identify with the poor. Their class access usually is high. Class consciousness is high. Out of all the groups, they're the only high class access group. and then their dominant framework is class. I didn't go into this, but the Christian recovery movement and 12-step movement is also a lower class identified group. Typically, it's ministry of those in addiction recovery. And it's a lower working class identification, and their dominant framework is going to be recovery. A multi-class white church or ministry with the poor. Their dominant class background is going to be middle and upper. The lower class identification is going to vary. Class access is high. Class consciousness is middle, and the dominant framework is actually this one should be race. I need to fix that. And then justice focused, multi-ethnic, white dominant. Actually, this would be a white ministry, so that is a dominant framework is class. So if you have white people who are poor and white people who are rich together, so justice focused, multi-ethnic, white ministry. It's giving resources to ministries of or with the poor and changing systems of injustice. The dominant class background is middle or upper. Lower class identification is going to be strong. Generally downwardly mobile. Class access is high. Class consciousness is low, and their dominant framework is race and gender. So now that is mapping them on this grid. You could also go into the 4-quadrant grid and try to map these groups. Now, all of these things I'm saying are generalizations, and I really apologize because the generalizations are going to be wrong for a lot of different groups. And but I feel like I need to be able to talk about the differences between the traditions overall, right? And it's the same thing here. And one thing that's also going to be different on this map is each group can't just be in one quadrant. Often, if I really were going to do this, I would draw a whole, area that they cover. But let me just go through and show this an example. So most majority culture churches are focused on personal salvation, and Christian recovery is more focused on, recovery and salvation, the 12-step movement. Then you have the physical needs. We talked about these different groups that are out there. You have homeless shelters, Christian community health programs that are out there. And then you have this cultural quadrant. So ethnic churches are going to be particularly strong in developing the cultural quadrant, developing world Pentecostal churches, the Salvation Army and rescue missions as positive communities for the poor. And then you're going to be you're going to have churches that have done well there. So the Black Church and the Civil Rights Movement, the Latino Christian or Catholic Workers Movement, Liberation Theology. Now you can have the different traditions here across the different quadrants. And part of the idea is that the Christian community development movement should cover all 4 quadrants, is the way I'm defining Christian community development. Now, often, I would say recently within the movement, it's been emphasizing the 4th quadrant the most. But the Black Church has done well across all 4 quadrants. The Catholic and Latino Church, or the Catholic Latino-Latina Church, often will cover both the cultural and the systems domain. Global Evangelical and Pentecostal Church and Protestant Latino-Latina Church, they often see both the need for the personal and physical. They're often pretty close to covering all 4 quadrants. Often, though, these groups will avoid this last quadrant, the social change quadrant, for political reasons and also for historical reasons. And then rescue missions, the Salvation Army, evangelical humanitarian aid, they're trying to meet, these personal needs, spiritual needs, but also the physical needs. But they're not trying to change systems. And then you have white middle-class evangelical churches that are primarily focused on the personal quadrant. And then you're going to have Latin American liberation theology and Catholic worker movement that's primarily trying to change systems. You have the social gospel. So social gospel is very focused on meeting physical needs and changing systems. And then you have justice and mainline denominations often is focused on changing systems. Now, again, this is a gross approximation. There's black churches that are all over the area. There's, you know, white middle class evangelical churches that are all over. But I'm saying on average, the cultural center is going to be somewhere, you know, around here. Now, in addition, so this is showing across the 4 quadrants. You can look at what's the cultural center of your organization across social class. So if you're serving the poor, are you organizationally close to your clients? Are you organizationally close to those you're providing funders? Or are you covering both? And I just want to kind of conclude saying that there's a lot of other social justice traditions that I didn't cover in depth. So Catholic social teaching, Eastern Orthodox social teaching, Asian social justice traditions, not affiliated with those already covered. African social justice traditions, not affiliated with those already covered. There's Anabaptist, Mennonite and Amish, the Lutheran, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Native American, indigenous peoples across the world, the Wesleyan Arminian holiness movements, Methodist social teaching, the social gospel, and part of what you got to understand, whenever I write a course, I got to do it for who is our audience, who are our students. So this course covers the traditions that are most closely related to our student body. So the sampling of traditions represents that rather than trying to be, here's an all-inclusive or a fully globalized perspective. Just because we cover tradition doesn't mean that we embrace everything in it. So but we want you to be aware of those. And a more global perspective would cover a lot more traditions in depth. I just want to show this map real quick. This is a family tree of Christian denominations. And you can see that you had a split between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church and other Orthodox traditions. Then you had the Protestant Reformation. That had some splits, and then, you know, out of the Anglican you had Methodist come out, and out of those you had Pentecostals and different denominations. Out of Methodist you got Salvation Army and Church of the Nazarene, and then you have Baptist, Congregationalist, and each of these have justice traditions, right? But there's no way I'm going to cover that in this course. Now, one other thing I want to emphasize is, no matter what your tradition is, part of the philosophy of this course is a lot of these Christian community development principles. So the principles of Christian community development are different from the Christian Community Development Association. The Christian Community Development Association, I would say, is a tradition. The principles of Christian community development could be applied across social justice traditions. So let me get into some of the key lessons in comparing justice traditions. So lesson number 1 is leverage the strength of your justice tradition and avoid trying to make it become another tradition. So general wisdom in life in general is just to major in leveraging your strengths and minor in addressing weaknesses. So that's true in your career. It's true with your personality type. That's true in community development. So if you are in the Salvation Army, don't try to be a black church. Unless you're a black church Salvation Army congregation, which there might be some of those, right? Or if you're a black church, you're not going to become, you know, a Latino church, right? And the other principle is unless you're leading a movement or organization, your ability to bring change will be limited. And if you try to get your tradition to change dramatically, you're probably going to get ejected. So that's not going to be helpful. And I'll talk a little bit about what do you do if parts of where you're working doesn't fit who you are. And I think a big part of that is you may need to span multiple traditions in order to both recharge and serve effectively. So that's the principle number 2. Principle number 3 is that differences in justice framework, social class, ethnicity, funding model, and the quadrant focus are the primary components for distinguishing social justice movements. So what happens is often social justice traditions will judge other traditions. I think it's good for social justice traditions to say, hey, this is what makes us unique. This is important. I think it's bad if, you know, you go into, well, that group's probably going to hell because they're not operating in the same quadrant, right? So And I think that often you'll see that, the people who are doing charity will judge the people who are trying to bring systemic justice change, and, try to differentiate without judging. And then the last one I already said, different Christian community development principles can be applied across different traditions, and recognize that different traditions will be stronger in different principles. So let me talk about this second point, achieving balance between service and recharging. So a lot of people are going to have a home culture tradition where they recharge, and a secondary culture tradition where they might serve. And I would encourage many of you to think about how are you going to do that. So when working cross-culturally, often individuals need to be able to recharge in their home culture. So let me use an example. I'm going to use a race and class grid, but honestly, people need to recharge across race, class, and gender. So in our leadership course, I talked about how you can do this across gender also. But for example, a middle-class African-American Christian serves cross-culturally in a lower-class white dominant rescue mission, but attends a middle-class black church. So he's serving or she's serving in a rescue mission at work, but then attends a middle-class black church, and that's a place to recharge. So then a Latino Christian from a lower-class background that's highly educated works at a white upper middle-class foundation. So works for a foundation giving grants, but attends a lower middle-class dominant Latino church. And what that's doing, this is showing that for this individual, he's bicultural across class. So he has two sides of his class identity, and he, is able to work effectively in the foundation, but he also likes to go to a lower middle class Latino church that feels a little bit more like home. That's something for me, being bicultural across class, that I also get. And then a white middle-class Christian might attend a white middle-class justice-focused church. And he may, be distraught saying, well, most of the people in my church are white, and might feel guilty about that. But he works cross-culturally in a lower-class dominant ministry serving the poor. And then he realizes that a good portion of the people in his church also are doing something the same. So that church is performing an important function for people who are serving cross-culturally for their day job, and then they come back and they need a home base to serve in. And all those things are really important, right? So just some frameworks if you want to do more research. I'm going to use some terms. You could Google these. So double consciousness was a term that was coined by Dubois, and it talks about how African Americans, whenever they go into majority culture, they basically have to have a different consciousness, right? Code switching, something similar. It often can be applied to language. The term, where you switch what code you're using. Often it's used across class, social class. Often I have to code switch whenever I'm working in different groups. Recognizing the difference between acculturation, which is a good thing, and that would be similar to learning another language. So learning another language is good. Assimilation is a bad thing. That would be like losing your original language, which is not good, right? So, and being bicultural and bilingual and social capital transfer. So all those things, if you want to look, deeper, these are all important concepts kind of in this space. And ultimately, in this space, we need to balance grace and justice. We need to stretch ourselves cross-culturally to promote justice, but we have to have the grace needed to maintain balance for personal and organizational health. And I see people judge people all the time. They're like, oh, you go to a white church, or you go to a middle-class church, or you go to this. The reality is we're all limited. None of us are Jesus. None of us are God. We have to go someplace to recharge. Recharging isn't selling out. Recharging is being smart. And so, we need to stretch ourselves. If people aren't stretching themselves at all, then that is being a part of the system. But having grace for people and to recognize that God's going to work differently with different people in different points in their life. So hopefully you found this helpful. I had asked that you give me grace in this if you felt that I'm judging your tradition or your organization wrong. I'm just trying to do the best I can. And I want to really try to affirm all the traditions, but hopefully this is helpful in thinking about some of the ways to compare the traditions and thinking about what is the role that each tradition has in the overall body of Christ. So thanks a lot.